Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I work at IE Business School Publishing, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Do you have something you'd like some help with? Ask our guests. Go to professorgame.com/question and get your question answered in a future episode. Well, engagers, and today we have Lennart Nacke. I'm not sure if I got that pronunciation right. Did I get it right, Lennart?
It's actually Lennart Nacke.
Lennart Nacke. Okay. So Lennart, are you prepared to engage?
Yes, make it so.
Let's do this. So Lennart is an associate professor and research director of the HCI Games Group at the University of Waterloo in Canada. Before, he also worked as an assistant professor in UOIT and as a postdoc in the International Lab of the University of Saskatchewan. I'm not sure if I got that one correctly. He has a Ph.D. in game development and loves to work in human-computer interaction and game design. And you can find his latest research in Google Scholar in his profile. So Lennart, is there anything I missed from that intro?
That's a pretty good introduction, yeah. You can Google my name and you'll find lots of stuff about me.
Yes, that's completely true. So Lennart, let's start with the first question, and that is, what does a regular day with Lennart look like when, I know you're in sabbatical right now, so it could be around your sabbatical regular days or when you're teaching or whichever you want to choose, it's fine.
So a regular, that's the question. Is it a regular day with my students or is it a regular day on sabbatical where it's basically get up, make yourself a tea or a coffee, review a current book and try to combine the latest insights into a new book or a new article or something like that, and then get on to writing. That's sort of the sabbatical mode where you're just kind of trying to write, a larger article or a book. Which is currently the goal. And if it's a non-sabbatical mode, it really depends on if it's during the term, where it's a lot of teaching. So that means, you get up, you make sure your slides are prepped, you teach a course, you take time to sit down with the students and hear what ails them and how you can improve their learning experience. And then, end of the day, you review the outcomes and whether or not you've achieved all of your to-dos, and it's usually if you get to 50%, you're good. And then you keep going. In the summer, it's a bit different. We do a lot of research. So in the summer, I actually have a buzzing lab, the HCI Games Group here at the University of Waterloo. And we have a lot of international visitors. So I usually, in the mornings, you can definitely tell the folks that are here from Germany or somewhere else in Europe or Brazil or like wherever they come from. They'll be there and we'll be maybe chatting. This summer we ran a summer school, so we had some high school kids there and just kind of gave some lectures and stuff for kids. And then you talk about research projects, you plan experiments, and you set stuff up in the lab. You just test if the equipment still works, and then well, not me, but the students would then run the experiment. And then they come back with the data. Usually we review the data together and maybe talk about some of the outcomes, maybe some questions about the statistics, and then get onto the writing of the paper, and then just kind of write the paper together and just try to target it at a conference or a journal or something.
So those would be mainly like doctoral or research students, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So in the summer, it's mainly the research group. So that's all graduate students. It's actually not all graduate students. It's the majority are PhD and master students, but we always have undergraduate researchers with us. So that's undergraduate students that are currently working on their bachelor's, and they tend to be super interested in doing some research or get engaged with games in some way. And some of them just end up, building a game in Unity or doing some instructional work or working with us on some 3D assets for some of the games. And others just get right into research and just support an experiment and, recruit participants or make sure that they run the session for the experiment. So they get people to come in, for example, we use a lot of physiological sensors. So make sure that all of those get put on properly and that the data is collected properly and all that stuff.
Very, very interesting. And we'll probably get a bit deeper into what you're doing with those sensors and all that stuff. But before we do, this is a question that I like to make to most of our guests, and it's for you to tell us some sort of a story, something that happened at some point of what you would maybe like to call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning that actually led you to whether that is a massive learning or maybe even future success because you learned something that you were able to apply after that. Is there such a story that you can tell us, Lennart? You don't have to name any specific names because I know there could be some sensitive people or companies that don't want to be named in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I fail all the time. That's just kind of common as an academic. You get so many rejections. Every paper that you write gets at least, rejected once. It's very unusual that you write a paper and it goes right from the start to publication. That's very rare. And even with some research projects, you think it's a good idea. I had a lot of projects on audio that I tried to study with physiological measures. And I think like 3 or 4 years later and a couple of research studies later, it's still not working in the way that I would have liked it to see or that I anticipated in my original hypothesis. And so, yeah, sometimes you have an idea that, okay, this certain measure will work with this phenomenon. And, you keep on studying it, but you can't find any significant results in your data. And yeah, that can be frustrating if that happens, year after year after year. And obviously you adjust and you find new ways and you add other measures to get at some of the research questions. But it can be a bit frustrating when some of your, most used methods can't give you the answers that you desire. And I think that's definitely one of the things that I had to struggle with some of the physiological data that we collected, where I was just wishing it would give me some more insights. In the end, it did not provide those in some fields. In other fields, it worked fine.
Is there something that now, knowing what you would have perhaps changed or done differently? I mean, of course, I'm not saying that the hypothesis, because if you haven't been able to prove that, you will probably change the hypothesis. But maybe what you did with the sensors, or is there something that you would have liked to start from a different perspective, and looking back now that you would have done or started differently, or if you start a new project that you now approach it in a different way because of the learnings that you had there?
Yeah, I mean, as a junior researcher, and I see that in some of my students that are coming from psychology, I was very much based on numbers. I cared a lot about, whether the numbers made sense. And the longer you do research, the more you're in that field, the more you embrace mixed methods and the more you embrace the qualitative side of things and just kind of, get a good feeling of what people are saying instead of just using it or instead of just looking at numbers all the time. So I think I've gotten way more open-minded over the years with how I assess, a successful research project than how I initially saw it. Initially, it was all, the stats have to make sense and then it's perfect, and only then is it good. But the more you learn about statistics, the more you learn about all the flaws that are attached to it, and how even some of the stuff that you would report as looking good or significant might not in the end, or might be disputable from a sort of statistical perspective, because in the end it all depends on how you're mapping your model to the real world and what methods you use and what sample you've collected and all that stuff. So there are a lot of shortcomings with that kind of research. And as a young researcher, I didn't see any of those shortcomings. I just believed, okay, the numbers will tell me. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that just believe, numbers are facts. And I think it's good to keep sort of a skeptical mindset with some of that, because oftentimes you will find different answers and oftentimes contradicting answers in collecting different sets of data and using different methods, observing and asking questions and running interviews versus just collecting plain old numerical data.
So I would gather from what you're saying that perhaps as a junior researcher, as you were saying, it was only numbers, and that they definitely give you a part of the story, but it's important to consider that it's just a part of the story, and that collecting different numbers from even the same experiment, the same situation, can give you a completely different answer. So I would say, that as always, to approach not only the numbers that you get in an experiment and those things, but the data in general that you collect, to take it as I say, with a pinch of salt, and see what other conclusions might be, lying underneath the surface, other things that you might be looking for as well, and to take a very, very deep look at what it is you're looking for, to make sure you're not missing it, because it's very easy to get lost in the numbers and statistics as well.
Yeah, essentially just keep a skeptical mindset. I think that's the most important thing if you're into academia and if you're into research. Never really trust the first result. Always question whether or not there could be a different perspective on things. And I think keeping that open mind will help you understand your research better.
Fantastic. Thank you for that story, Lennart. So the next one is taking a 180-degree spin on that question, and it would actually be of something that would be perhaps a very big challenge, or the biggest challenge that you faced and solved using ideas from games or a game or gamification, game thinking, call it whatever you feel is most appropriate. But something that you solved using this mindset, this way of approaching problems that perhaps you learned from game design or designing a game itself. Can you tell us a story of some success and what we can learn from it?
I wish there was just one story. I mean, there's a lot of sure. There's a lot of different stories in terms of some of the problems that we've tried solving and that we try to understand. I mean,
maybe something that you approached and you said, well, I'm gonna go this way, and it actually went the way you or sort of the way that you expected from the start, and you got some results that say, well, this is something that I can actually use. I don't know, for my future research, or for teaching in class, or for letting students know something new or different. I don't know, something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, in the early days of gamification, when we're just kind of figuring out what exactly it is, what we're doing there, and how we're supposed to use some of that stuff, I think a lot of us made a lot of mistakes in terms of how can we actually use these games in something that's not a game. And a lot of us started using it in our classrooms and like building software around it. I had this wonderful project back in the day where we had a social media sort of tracking tool, and we were trying to engage students on Twitter and just kind of see how active they are in the online discussion and whether or not that can influence the grading and all that stuff. And back then it seemed like it was a cool thing to do. Gamification was getting kind of hot, and so was social media. But in hindsight, I think there are a lot of dangers attached to, of course, social media use, as well as using only certain elements of games and not looking at what actually drives the students in the first place, and just kind of using just sort of an external reward system. Some of the stuff that at the start, we were just kind of looking at, oh yeah, this is all very exciting. We add challenges, we add reward systems and all that stuff. But in the end, the more we studied games, or the more I studied games at least, and the more you look deeper into game design and some of the underlying concepts and principles that are so important for the enjoyment of these things, I think then it becomes much clearer to you that maybe it is not as easy to transfer some of these ideas into something that's not a game. So I think, when I started, the biggest thing was just thinking a lot of this design would be easy, and over the years figuring out that really good design needs good constraints to work, and also needs a lot of thinking attached to it, in how this design turns into something that can be implemented and can actually be successful for changing the user experience.
That's fantastic, and that's very nice insights, especially because there's people who have been like you around for maybe from the start or nearly from the start, and have been around since then. But there's a lot of people getting into it right now or very recently, and who perhaps didn't realize all these pitfalls that could have come in those early times when these were just observations around in the marketplace, in the companies, in the academia, that you could see things going on, and that there were perhaps, I'm not sure if I would call it mistakes, but misunderstandings in a way of what were good elements and what was good design for gamification. And it's important to remember that you can, just like in games, that you have good games and not so good games, you can also have a good gamification design and a not so good gamification design. You can do it well or you can do it unwell, and it doesn't mean that the discipline in itself is good or bad. It just means that there's some people who do, well, not only people, but there are certain occasions when there's a good design and certain occasions when it's not. I mean, I'm not sure if I would say that every single game launched, for example, like a very big company like Nintendo, everything that they launched is fantastic. No, but they're still a phenomenal company and they've done phenomenal things. So I mean, it's hard to keep in mind that not everything that is done, even by the best people, is always a complete success. And that there's many things to learn in the process, and that you have to look deep, as you were saying, not only into the superficial things that games have if you want to implement into gamification, but go deeper and go into what's the motivations of the users, of the players. What are they thinking? Why are they actually motivated by these mechanics? What are you looking to gain from such a design so that they would be interested, motivated, engaged into, for example, into your class? I mean, it's not just spilling in some leaderboards and some points and some badges. It's you have to think it through and do it as best as you can with as deep of a knowledge of your players, your objectives, and all the possible mechanics that you could use. So that's a fantastic story, Lennart. And finally, for this section, we would like to ask you, Lennart, when you're designing some sort of gamification design or something that you want to solve through this game thinking sort of framework, do you follow some sort of a process when you're doing these things? And if you do, what does that process look like? Can you give us, for example, maybe the steps that you take or the way that you approach the problem?
I think the main thing that we tend to often forget is that games need to kind of keep their purity as well, right? Like part of why games work so well is because of our voluntary engagement with them, right? Like once something is mandatory, and probably lots of listeners have read the mandatory fun paper and probably some of the literature on gamification, there is a huge problem with some of these misunderstandings that are out there and in regards to what makes it successful for a gameful design, or what makes a gameful design successful, what makes it work, right? And oftentimes it doesn't work if it becomes some mandatory interaction. So I think that's sort of at the heart of the process. If you're designing a process, you have to keep that in mind, that whatever you're designing, if it's something that is an action, let's say for human resources or in a larger company, or something that you just, the users need to do it, then how do you circumvent that? That on the one hand, they have to do it. On the other hand, you want them to have fun. And I think that's kind of where it becomes, where you get into those borderlines between, is it still game design then, or is it just something that's just designing for an aesthetic experience, designing just for a good user experience, removing friction and all of these other things that user experience designers do. So I think it's just a matter of being open-minded in that space. Yes, you could go to something and you could just have your game designer mindset and you say, okay, these are my tools that I use. I set my goals, I set my quests, I break down basically the overarching goal in a smaller task list, and I give that to people, and then people, okay, they have their little achievements that, okay, I've completed this item off my list. Okay, I have a sense of progress because I see all that feedback on my screen, and then I can transfer that feedback somehow into points or an entire in-game economy or whatever I have. And that's all fine and dandy, but that's very game design focused, right? So on the other hand, you might have a very, very, very strictly defined task, and then you have to ask yourself, so how do I turn that task, or parts of that task at least, into a more pleasurable experience? And to design these pleasurable experiences, sometimes it works to add these game elements on top, and sometimes it just doesn't work. And sometimes you just kind of want to really just remove the friction and really just build a very good user experience. So essentially, for the process, the first thing is determining what do I have? Like, what am I designing? And understanding that artifact. And once you're clear on what that artifact is, then to take either the game design route, or to say, okay, I'm going to approach this more in a gameful user experience design kind of way, where I'm trying to build a really good user experience. And again, that just at that point, you just follow a standard process, right? You would say, okay, we start with some requirements gathering. We start with some initial ideas about the people that are using it. We survey our users. That's always at the start, right? Like if you don't start looking at potential users and looking at the potential human that's part of the interaction, then you're setting yourself up to fail. Like that's the most important thing. So don't just start with, okay, this is a good design, this is a good tech spec, and we're going to work from there. I mean, that's important too, but that tech spec should actually be based upon the first feedback of what do our users actually want to get out of this interaction with this technology. So everything that I design, I usually break down in this initial interaction with technology. So what is that interaction? Is it a software? What is that software supposed to help people with? If it's a game, what is that game supposed to give people other than fun? Are they supposed to be learning something? Are they supposed to engage? Is it God of War? Is it like a huge story? Are they supposed to engage a little bit with ancient mythology and that kind of stuff? Or what is this about? And when you had Gustavo on the show, he talked about a lot of stuff. But I think one of the things that's interesting that's coming out of his research is that there are different personalities that enjoy different types of gamification, right? And one of the things that we do know is some people really enjoy a sort of a narrative bit, and other people just don't care, right? Like other people are really more on the collection side or other things that you can do in games. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you really need to think about the user once you have decided what artifact you're going to design. Look at what the requirements from the users are, and then follow a natural design process by building a first prototype, and then just go into your iterative cycles and checking that prototype back with the users, and getting that feedback, incorporating that feedback, building the next prototype, and so forth. Then it just becomes iterative design at that point. Whether it's game design or user experience design, is the same process.
I have two questions on what you were mentioning. Well, one is more of a comment than a question, because it's easy to think of games as I've heard this definition before. I'm not sure exactly where I heard it before. That games are basically a series of obstacles that you voluntarily get into for reaching an objective. I mean, there's always easier ways from getting from A to B than the ones that are restricted by the rules of a game. So that's when you were talking about the difference between just a smooth user experience design, like eliminating the obstacles. That's why I'm guessing that it's why you separate it very succinctly from game design itself. Is that right?
I'm not sure I'm getting the question 100%.
No, I mean, that one was just...
that's just a comment.
I don't know if you've heard the same definition of a game, of saying, among other things, that a game is a series of obstacles that you put users that are reaching, or the players that want to reach a certain objective. So, I mean, if you're playing Zelda, it's always easier to get from point A to B, just walking from here to there. But if you start putting, these monsters or these quests or all these things that you have to achieve before getting to point B, you're just making it harder. So it's a series of obstacles, and that's where I understood that you draw the line between, in one way, going for sort of game design sort of techniques, and on the other hand, going for user experience. Is that the kind of differentiation you made between these two types of projects?
Yeah, that's actually kind of nice, because that relates a lot to the stuff that we talk about in our games user research book. I don't know if you've come across that, but that's definitely one of the things that's talked about in terms of how is games user research different than regular user research. Well, in games, we're actually building the problems into the game, into the game, right? And exactly. Those are not interaction problems, but they're, as you said, obstacles or some things that you need to overcome. So I've not necessarily heard it as a definition in terms of game design, because there's more this whole interesting choices and player agency and meaningful choices, meaningful engagement with these obstacles and all that stuff. But yeah, obstacles, dilemmas, all that stuff is part of game design for sure. But then I think where you're right is the main difference between user experience design for games and user experience design for applications. For applications, you want to remove all of the friction. For user experience design in games, you want to remove the friction so that you can get to the other friction, which is the obstacles.
Make it easier.
Make it easier to get frustrated in a certain amount. So not too much frustration, but enough frustration that you're willing to learn and overcome some of these challenges. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think it's the best definition for games. I was just mentioning because I remembered. And again, if you're making meaningful choices, it's because you can do A or B instead of you just having the easy pathway of going from A to B. So that was what I meant. And the other question is that I had is when you reach a project and you have to decide, well, I'm going for more like game design or I'm going more for user experience design. How do you have some rule of thumb that in general helps you guide when you decide to go for A or for B, for game design or for user experience design?
Yeah, I think it's there's no rule of thumb. It's really an individual decision every time you're encountering a problem. But some tasks and some environments just lean more towards game design, and some things that are very system critical do not lean towards that. I'd say delight or that ease of interaction that you can find in games in general. So if you're talking about flight control, that's a standard example, or the navigation things in a jumbo jet or something where there's actually lives at stake, and it might actually be too distracting if you get too engaged with some of the stuff. So you want to maintain sort of a low but conscious level of engagement. And there's a lot of applications where you need that, where you need sort of a conscious engagement, but not an overly fun, too engaging kind of way where it just kind of takes you away and you're not.
You're distracted from what the main objective would be.
Yeah, exactly. So and then so like some things you actually want. For me, it's usually the idea: do you want people to be in flow, right? Like for some things, you want people to be in flow, whether it's a writing application or something like that. Yeah, you want somebody to get really into it and just kind of get taken away by it, and that's great, and that often works in these scenarios. But yeah, it's really, I guess, a gut feeling that you go with at the start. Like, I wish I could just have a ruler or some measure.
No, that's fine. That's fine. You were talking about that, and I remembered a past guest. I don't know if you know Zach Fitzwalter. He's from Australia, and he's talking back then. I'm not sure if he's still on that now. He was working on an application for safer driving for exactly. First drivers. And so, of course, I mean, exactly, that's a clear example where you don't want people to be like too engaged with the app. You want them to be engaged with the app as long as it's useful for them to drive safely. But if they're too engaged with an app in their cell phones, it's not going to be very safe driving. So I guess that there's a very clear distinction in those kinds of situations as well.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually a neat example that you're talking about Zach's research, because some of the ideas that we're having now is so what happens if you don't have to do most of the driving, right? Like what if you were in something like an autonomous car, for example, and you would then you would want to find a way to get people engaged with sort of going back to driving, but then also being engaged with the other people on the road, right? Because you have more time to spend on that engagement because you don't have to drive all the time because you have the autopilot, right? And at that point, I think, that leans much more into the field of where you can actually gamify that process a bit.
Definitely. I love the approach that you have to those things as well. Engagers, quick break from this interview. If you love what gamification can achieve, then you will love going to a gamification conference. And this year, we got a 10% discount for the Engagers to assist to Gamification Europe 2018 in Amsterdam. All you have to do is get your tickets for the conference at professorgame.com/gamificationeurope. That's our affiliate link. It was an incredible experience in 2017, full of chances to learn and interact with the top experts. If you think you want to make it, get your tickets sooner rather than later. Their prices are only going up and tickets might run out. So click pause and go to professorgame.com/gamificationeurope to get your tickets discounted today and also support Professor Game. And now, Lennart, we're going to go into what I like to call like the sort of the second part of these interviews. And in this section, we're going to go more for like tools, tips, tactics, quick answers in general of things that might be very applicable for the people who are listening. And the first one is a very straightforward question in that sense. Is if there's something that you would say is sort of a best practice or something that you would say that a gamification or a game design approach project would benefit from? I mean, is there some element? Well, maybe not because that sounds like I'm asking for a mechanic in particular, but some sort of approach or something that you would say, well, if you think of this when you're using your gamification project, it's certainly going to benefit. Your projects are going to be a little bit better or a lot better by thinking of this or by doing these kinds of things.
Well, I generally hate endorsing, one silver bullet kind of thing for these things, because again, like good design is all about, the individual choices, and good design is very much about your individual problem and figuring out how you can find an individual solution to that problem. And that being said, I do like these tools, some of the stuff that we worked on together with Gustavo and with Andre, with the different models with Hexat but even some of my stuff back in the day with BrainHacks. So anything that helps people doing some sort of personality assessment, I think is helpful for sure. I would say more generally just listening to the user, because that's really the mantra of all of our design here. I mean, we all do user experience. Before we do game design, we do user experience research. And I can't stress that enough, because oftentimes that gets forgotten, to really listen to what do your users actually want. Have you done an analysis? I think it's much better these days, specifically with the rise of games user research and user experience design in games. We find a lot more of that. We have a lot more companies having dedicated UX teams in games. We have game UX summits and stuff like that these days. But it's still more recent. If you look back, 20 years ago, it wasn't like that. Like some of these games that were designed for coin-operated machines, you can still feel that sort of game design legacy, where it was highly frustrating and engaging because they wanted you to put more coins in the machine, right? Obviously, they wanted to maximize the money that they're making with some of these arcade machines. So I think, a lot of that, the view on how you design some of these digital artifacts has changed for sure. And it is important to look at what that means for modern designers. So what should a modern designer do? Modern designers should always really find out how they assess their niche. Instead of building a game for everyone, sure, you can build something like Grand Theft Auto and like a big, huge sandbox where everyone can play with different elements and it just caters to a large variety of people. But it's much more common to really identify a niche and say, hey, has somebody actually played around with these mechanics? Would that be an engaging new thing to do? I bet you that's... To quote some of my favorite games, I bet you that's how Shovel Knight came about. With somebody's like, so what if we had a knight and then we had this shovel mechanic? Because that's kind of cool. You can dig into stuff and then you can find some coins and money and like that's how I imagine it anyways. And so I think that's just kind of cool, because somebody's like, let's put these two things together, like that weird process of digging and then a knight and make that into a game. And sometimes I think that's how the most creative stuff gets done. We take two things that we wouldn't necessarily put together in our mind, and then we try to combine them, and it ends up being this beautiful thing that is highly engaging. So the best process is listening to your users and then trying to get inspiration from as many diverse backgrounds that you can get.
Fantastic. That's very, very useful, and understanding your users, your players, is definitely fundamental for any project. And the next question is a bit different in that sense. So we would like to know, what is your favorite game?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I just quoted Shovel Knight as one of my, definitely something I enjoy playing. But I really like the Uncharted series. That's sort of my cinematic go-to when I like, sort of the couch experience where it's just like watching a movie, but you're actually playing it. I do like any sort of Metroidvania style games, the original Metroids, and the side-scrolling ones, at least the 2D ones. I like most Zelda games. Recently picked up Breath of the Wild, played that on the Switch. One of my favorite multiplayer games is Overcooked. Overcooked is one of the things we love playing when we're playing together with the lab. Overcooked and Lovers in a Dangerous Space-Time. Those are the two co-op go-tos that we absolutely enjoy when we're playing together with four people.
So those were a few, and that's fantastic. So Lennart, is there anybody that you would like? Because Gustavo, for example, said he wanted to listen to you, and I definitely wanted to listen to you as well in an interview like this one. But is there somebody else that you would enjoy listening to in an interview here in Professor Game?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of game professors out there that I think would be worth interviewing. There's also a lot of people in industry. I certainly can give you a list of people. One of my friends in Queensland, Daniel Johnson, he's a fun person to talk to. He's worked with Zach before, Zach Fitzwalter, and he definitely is very knowledgeable about games. My colleague Anders Drachen from York University or University of York, in the UK. I would love if you can reach out to somebody like Ian Livingston, who works for Electronic Arts in Vancouver, Zach Toops, who is in Texas, or even Regan Mandrick, my former supervisor, who's in Saskatchewan.
That's a beautiful list. Thank you very much. At the end, if you want, and you can help us get in contact with one or more of these, it would be amazing, so that we can have them totally at some point in the podcast. And as well, in that series of recommendations of things and people to listen to, is there a book that you would like to recommend to our listeners, to the engagers?
Our book, of course, the Games User Research book.
Yes, of course, definitely. That's top of mind.
Yeah, so I mean that's definitely the big recommendation. I have a lot of books that I like to read, probably way more than is good for me. I mean, yeah, it's nothing is ever really bad in reading a book, but I do have a lot of books that are not game related that I think are interesting. But I think in terms of for game related book that can actually help game designers, I think our Games User Research is definitely a good book for user research. There are other books on game design that I really like. The Art of Game Design from Jesse Schell has been really useful in most of my classes that I taught, and the Game Design Workshop books from USC, from the faculty there that were, or is it UC? University of Southern California, yeah. I think those are the two ones that I would recommend.
Fantastic books, fantastic. I'll put a link up in the show notes to your book and to those that you have just mentioned. And Lennart, is there something that you would say is your sweet spot or your superpower when you're designing these either game design sort of things or user experience design? Is there something that you would say, well, this is where I add perhaps the most value when I'm participating in these kinds of projects?
I think it's asking the right questions. I think that's something that I tend to do a lot with my students and with clients, like the company that we have with Gustavo Motiviex, where we engage with people that want to gamify things and don't know how. I think oftentimes it's just asking the client or the student the right question in terms of identifying what their problem is. And once a person understands their problem, then we can work on building good constraints that help us design for that problem and finding a solution. So I think, yeah, problem solving through asking questions, that's a superpower.
Superpower. Making the right questions is always fundamental. And finally, this is sort of a slightly gamified question, so to speak, because it's a random question that the audience sends us a bunch of questions, and we have a list, and we randomly select one of them that, of course, that makes sense for the interview. And this one that we're going to make today, it seems interesting, and I'm not sure if it's something that you've approached very much, but I'm sure you'll have a stab at it for sure. And this person says, how does AI, artificial intelligence, relate to gamification, especially in education? Do you think it is something that a non-techie professor can take advantage of? And of course, if you think so, how could this person take advantage of AI?
I think a lot of people can take advantage of AI. I mean, AI is such a large field that incorporates so many subfields, where it essentially boils down to building a computer program that is somewhat intelligent and that can react to your input in an intelligent way. You can already see AI and some sort of gamified ways of dealing with AI in the personal assistants that we have, whether it's Siri or Google Home or Alexa or whatever these connected devices are called, where you're engaging in a conversation, but then sometimes you can ask very silly questions and there's a playful answer coming back from that assistant at that point. And just to be able to create something that is playful like that, there needs to be a certain level of machine intelligence at that point. And I think that is definitely one of the things where it becomes interesting. I think generally artificial intelligence that somehow gets playful in their suggestions, because a lot of the AI that we see is recommender systems or some sort of machine learning processing, the stuff that you see at Netflix, the suggested movies and things like that. That's the everyday AI that we get exposed to, I guess, most of the time. And in these cases, it would be nice to see, more playful suggestions, something where the AI is not just limited to the heuristic that's coming in from the selection of past behavior, but if it adds some sort of a fun function or fun prediction, right? Like this is kind of where a computer scientist could look into the algorithm and think about, can I add something that adds something unexpected to my selection process that might trigger some sort of joyful response from the person that's engaging with that artificial intelligence. So in those contexts, I could definitely see some sort of gameful interaction happening.
Very, very interesting, and thank you very much for that. And finally, just to finish the interview, is there any final advice that you would like to to give to the engagers, and then please let us know how can we connect with you, see more of your work aside, of course, from your book. How can we get in touch with you, and of course that final piece of advice if you have any.
So final piece of advice would probably be to again always listen first and then develop. So I think practicing listening is a really good skill for any designer. Practicing active listening and processing, and hopefully identifying what the problem was that was being discussed or that was being mentioned, and then using that to your advantage as a designer and finding a solution to addressing that problem. So active listening, definitely a very good skill that everyone should try and cultivate somehow. And then I think, in terms of how to reach out to me, I have a website, acagamic.com, which hasn't been updated in years. But we have my research group is at hcigames.com. If you look for HCI Games Group, and if you Google us, you can find us on YouTube. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. We're on all of the different platforms. And every once in a while, there's content coming out there. We have a blog on Medium where you can find us as well. And just Google HCI Games Group at the University of Waterloo, and you'll find lots of different information.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Again, thanks for your time. I know you're right now in your sabbatical, so even though days are different, I'm sure they're very busy as well. There's many. You're not taking a sabbatical as a vacation, so there's many things that you do anyway. So I thank you very much for your time. But now it's time for us to say it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And if you want more details of this interview with Lennart, you can go to professorgame.com/podcast/045 because this is episode 45. There you can also subscribe, and that way we'll be in contact and you will have exclusive access to opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And in fact, if you're even considering going to the conference Gamification Europe 2018 in Amsterdam this November, we have a special deal there. You can also go directly to professorgame.com/gamificationeurope and you will get a 10% discount. See you there!